Hey, Hope Warrior. Thank you so much for tuning in to another story. Stephanie and I love sharing them with you. We know that hearing how other people reclaim their power impacts your mindset in amazing ways. We have another story to share with you today, but before we jump into that, I would love to invite you to join us for the next Hope Warrior Academy. We are claiming our power together in community through a 4-week journaling journey. Stephanie and I are working through this now with a small group of women, and we are so excited about what we are learning. We cannot wait to bring it to more people virtually, and we are starting September 7th. So pause this and head on over to www.hopewarriorproject.com to register. Go ahead, I'll wait. We sincerely hope to get the opportunity to work with you on getting unstuck and living your purpose. Until then, let's get to more stories. Amy spent a large portion of her life thinking something was wrong with her. She felt powerless over her reactivity, and she did not know how to cope with certain sensations that she was having in her body. This led to her reacting in shame, rage, and isolation. It wasn't until she learned about reactive attachment disorder that she realized that her trauma was a result of the lack of love and connection that she felt with her mother as a young child. Understanding what caused these instinctual reactions was a huge relief, but she still needed to figure out how to heal. Today, Amy will share her story and how she learned to find her joy again. I will check back with you to go over what we can take away from Amy's story to claim power in our own lives.
Welcome to the show, everyone. I am honored to have the lovely Amy Erickson with me today. Thank you so much for joining me.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I know for myself, I did not know what reactive attachment disorder was until we spoke. And so I'm assuming a large portion of our audience might not know either. So why don't we just start there?
Okay.
And if you can explain and describe what that is.
Okay. Reactive attachment disorder is really a diagnosis that describes the outcome of what happens when an infant doesn't bond securely with the mother during infancy and like up to the first year and a half or so. A healthy attachment between a mother and an infant happens when the baby's crying and the mother, brings the baby up to her face and maybe coos and cuddles and says calming words and maybe rocks her and they make eye contact. And that process, which happens quite often over and over again with infants, continually enables the child's nervous system to feel secure and calm, and it really allows for optimal development of the child's nervous system. But what happens if that doesn't happen and the child is left to cry? They begin to feel that the distress is never calmed. So that nervous system learns that, it's not safe. And they learn as adults or as they grow up that others are not reliable to provide calming. But that's also the nervous system telling them that their nervous system knows. And so they end up, and this is what happened to me, is they begin to only rely on themselves for security or comfort or self-soothing. And that is not a healthy way to grow up, because we need others and especially need relationships, and that damage early on can affect our ability to form bonding relationships with others, especially intimate partners. And so the outcome for me was growing up in constant distress, either shutting down and using drugs and alcohol in my teens and 20s to soothe, dealing with it through anger. Although that didn't come for me until many years later, it was mostly shutting down, isolating myself, or self-soothing with substances.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, thank you for explaining that. It really helps kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about. So help us understand like how this played out in your life. And we've talked a little bit about it already with some of the anger and all. But what did that look like? If you have any specific examples that you could share.
Sure. Well, I mentioned that I learned to only rely on myself. And so I actually was quite accomplished as a student. And I did well in college, but I spent most of my 20s um, trying to self-soothe with drugs and alcohol and sex. And that, unfortunately was not a healthy way because I was still trying to form those emotional bonds through promiscuity. I was always in fear of emotional disconnection, and it played out most predominantly with my family. I mean, I can remember going back to visit my family. I actually moved 2,000 miles away from them, which is classic, fight, flight, or fear, or fight or flight behavior. I went as far away as I could, but I spent my entire 20s and 30s wanting to reconnect with my family. And I can remember going to a cabin we rented together as a family. And we were all together, but the entire time I was there, I felt like I was on the outside. They had formed their own bonds that I left because I left. And I spent the rest of my life up to this very day always trying to get back in. And it was very painful. And it's, yeah, that memory I think is the most difficult for me because it really has never healed. But what happened, I would become very dysregulated. And that means in the presence of my family, I was either crying out. My distress was, I want you to understand me. Let's talk about our feelings. Mom, can we talk about what happened when I was young? Well, that was never, she would deny anything. And I forgot to mention that as we all grew up as teens, my mom's post-traumatic stress really started to take hold, and her rage and her anger came in the form of emotional abuse toward me, and then a lot of physical abuse and rage. So you learn that when you're growing up too. I mean, that was the behavior I saw.
Sure. Now, I guess over time, or as you were kind of going through this and feeling this disconnection, did you have any idea that, like your experiences as, a baby or whatever were kind of the underlying reason for some of your reactions or your feelings, or was it just like you didn't know why this was happening?
I did not know why it was happening. And I didn't know why someone who had, everything, if you look at my life on the surface, I always was well dressed. I, looked good. I had great grades in school. I did not know what was wrong with me. And I was, and why did I become a drug addict and alcoholic? Where was that? What was that doing? And how did that happen? I didn't know these things. But when I finally did get clean and sober in my late 20s, I was still struggling with these same issues. Um, I had to go on antidepressants to keep my rage under control. And so when I talk about rage, what I'm talking about is the protest of, I want emotional connection and I am not feeling felt by you. And that fear of disconnection, just especially around my family now, was a physiological thing. So in my 20s, I started having a lot of health issues. And, here I am, clean and sober. I should be healthy. Well, that wasn't the case. I mean, I had endometriosis. I had, bleeding episodes or ended up in the hospital. I ended up with fibromyalgia. And by the time I was 35, I had my thyroid had shut down. So here's my body going, hey, listen to me. There's something wrong. And yet, the therapist just wanted me to be on antidepressants. My husband, who also couldn't manage my either anger or, disconnecting, which I also need to describe as a way people who have post-traumatic stress, or what I call post-traumatic distress, manage our fear. We isolate so that we don't have conflict that we can't control, because that kind of conflict signals you're about to be abandoned by somebody because they don't want to deal with that. And so I had all these things happening at about age 35. And I finally found a doctor. And by the way, I had a professional career. So I was, doing everything right. I was the good daughter. Anyway, I found a doctor who, because I was having all these episodes with endometriosis and bleeding and extreme pain. So I went to him. I said, I have endometriosis. They say it's not that bad. Why am I in so much pain? Why do I have stomach problems all the time and infertility? And he said, he asked me about my childhood. And I talked to him about what I told you about how I was raised and then how my mother dealt with us, with anger and rage on her part. And he said, well, you never had a support system. You had never had a way to cope. And now that you don't use drugs and alcohol, you have never learned how to process what's going on. And your body is a barometer that's telling you that you need to take a look at it because it's telling you that you're not well. And it's the pain is telling you something.
I feel like we've heard that often, when we do these interviews about, some trauma, whether, and they call it, big T, little t, it could be a big, huge trauma. It could be the smaller, I always say like death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? Like these things happen in our life and it does affect our bodies. And I think before, Lydia and I started doing this work, I never really knew that, never really realized it. But it makes sense, our body, well, gosh, we know if when we get stressed out, I know for myself, I'll say when I get stressed out, how I will get sick, I will have upset stomach, all these different things. If that's just from normal stress, what other things could be happening in our bodies from other, traumatic things that have happened in our past or whatever. So there's definitely something to that. So it's just, you're reconfirming to me that there's something to that. And I think it's good for us to be aware of it, because if we do notice we've got something, continually going on in our body or continually having some issues, maybe we need to look deeper at that, right? Then maybe there's something else going on and not just try to mask it, put a Band-Aid on with, a pill or whatever, that is necessary at times to help us get through it, but there might be something deeper. And I thought it was interesting too, you said, you were doing everything right. And that is another thing that I feel like we hear often. And when we feel like, hey, I'm doing everything right, I'm a good person, I'm holding down a job, I'm, all this kind of stuff. Why am I feeling like this? That's just probably another sign, right? That there's something we haven't maybe realized or acknowledged.
Right. Well, one thing that's important that I learned later on, it took a long time, was that our our nervous systems are on constant surveillance for the external things in our world. And that is always being fed into our bodies. So even if you didn't have a big traumatic experience, if you never grew up with the ability to sense what your body's telling you and make sense of that, integrate that with your mind, you will always create your own narrative. Well, my family it's all their fault, or it wasn't. And that was what I did. I blamed for so long everybody else for my problems. And it was really painful for me to come to realization of that. And so even telling the story about being raised by my mom this way is feels very risky. I mean, that's why, well, let me just say, they did the best job they could. And I absolutely love my parents and, never really wanted to ever tell these stories. But, when you remember as a child sitting in your room, crying your eyes out, and your mother walking in and looking at you, and this is like maybe when I was 5 or 6, and just walking out, never asking what was wrong, never trying to comfort you, that memory is profound. And it happened again in my mid 30s when I was married to my husband, who, by the way, was pretty much my mom. The relationship was, I married my mom, very emotionally distant, and disapproving, and, not one to comfort when there was something wrong. It'd be like, my mother would say, stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. So at about age 38, I think, I had emotional breakdown, and I found myself in the exact same place on the floor, sobbing. And all I could visualize was my mother in the room saying the same thing. And it was about that moment when I realized, I have to make a change. And it was a long time before I could make the change, but I knew something had to change at that point.
So do you feel, I mean, was that kind of the turning point for you, that moment, that realization?
Yes, it was. And it was huge, because I began to talk about the family dysfunction and the things that happened with my siblings to hopefully get that, connection. And they didn't want to talk about it. I went to my mom to try to talk to her about it. She didn't want to talk about it. Went to my husband, and he just said, get over it. They did the best they could. And I by age, in my mid 40s, then this went on for a long time, me trying to figure this out. I said, I can't do this anymore. I'm not going to survive. I mean, I had already attempted suicide in my teens. And by that time, that's all I could think about was ending my life. And I knew I had to do something. So I told my husband, I need to heal, and this marriage is not going to be the place I do it in. And so we divorced in my late 40s. So that was the big turning point for me, because I vowed, I prayed to God for, guidance. I was like, I know divorce is a sin, but I also know, not living the life you gave me is a sin. So yeah, that was a huge turning point in leaving my first husband.
Yeah, I can understand that that had to be a really hard decision to make, especially, after being married for so long. And, you mentioned earlier about how, you desired the connection, but at the same time, you would isolate. So it's like this, two sides, which one? I want the connection, but I'm afraid. Yeah. So when we talked before, I know you also, you came across this idea of the reactive attachment disorder. And it seemed like, that was kind of an eye-opening aha moment for you as well. We'll talk about that a little bit.
Oh yeah, I was a grant writer working freelance and writing grant proposals for an organization that placed foster children with new families, and researching this thing called attachment disorder. And that's very common when foster children are, the lives they live prior to coming to their new family. There's a huge, problem because they don't bond automatically, and the bonding has already been damaged by their early childhood. Anyway, I was reading this research and I just went, oh my gosh, that's me. And I looked at that and I said, that was when I realized I need to look at what's really happened in my past. And when I really started talking to my siblings and tried to explain that to my husband and asked my mother, and everybody was like, we don't want to talk to you about this. This didn't happen. You had everything. And I would like to mention, in my marriage to my husband, I also had everything a person could want. It's this classic, beautiful home. I had, everything I wanted to do. It was the same thing over again, just empty. And I would sit in my bedroom, isolating myself from him toward the end of our marriage, night after night after night. Because, attachment behavior, or my attachment desire, was a yo-yo behavior. It's like, I would try to attach and then I would feel unsafe. And I mean, I had everything but joy in my life.
Oh. And I mean, I'm just, as you're talking, I'm taking this in and trying to like picture what that would be like, to go through that. And it feels painful. I mean, I feel for you, because that had to be so painful. And again, you mentioned, in your marriage, you had everything you wanted, but it just makes me think, if we're not content and calm in our soul, it doesn't matter if we have everything, and we hear that, money can't buy you happiness, right? Money's great to have, all of it. Yes, I appreciate, the things that I have, my home and everything. But if you're unsettled in your soul, or there's this discontentment and this anger and war and rage and everything that's going on, it doesn't really matter if everything else looks like it's going okay in your life, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. They talk about people who have post-traumatic stress as the important step is to heal that attachment wound before you try to heal anything else. Because if you don't understand what that attachment wound is doing and how your body is, manifesting it, it's really hard to intellectualize everything else. However, I started intellectualizing it all and then went down to the body and figured it all out that way.
So how do you heal from something like that? What's that look like?
Um, I actually tried a lot of different things. So I wanted to not be continually taking antidepressants and having the dose having to be up and up and up and up. I wanted to stop feeling numb because that's where I was. I was numb. And so my doctor agreed to, help me move off of that and try acupuncture. So I did. And honestly, that opened up my body and started making me realize connecting it back up to my brain in a way that I had never experienced before. The sensations that I had been shoving down and the feelings I had not addressed were starting to emerge.
Mm.
And it was sort of you know, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, man. It was, it's like, whoa, I'm really, and at that time I had met my second, who would be the man who would become my second husband. Um, and I was experiencing everything. And it was a little crazy, like I was having the rage, having the, depression and not sure, and I couldn't regulate my emotions. And then external things, our body, again, our nervous system, takes in every experience that we are exposed to and incorporates that with anything that's already in our body. Well, I had my husband's daughter, basically hated me and did not want me to marry her father. And so we ended up going to a therapist to try to resolve some of the issues because my husband, had never met somebody that was so emotionally up and heightened and reactive, and we wanted to have that emotional connection. We wanted this to be a success. So we went to therapy, and the therapist said, Amy, after hearing your childhood story, I can understand why you're depressed and why you're really struggling. And she said, but now they know that the brain has neuroplasticity. You're not stuck with the brain that you grew up with. You can change that. And I just, man, the research geek in me was off and running. And that was when I learned about, the work of Dr. Dan Siegel. I think that was probably the most important transition for me, was learning about attachment from him and attunement. So, when a mother and a child are looking at each other, there's an attunement that takes place in the brain. And that attunement is, it puts the brain in a calm state also, so that the amygdala is not able to continually hijack you when you have a fear attack. So I learned all these things and I realized, this is what I need to do. And so at the same time, my husband bought this book, which I still have. It's called Hold Me Tight. It's for it's for developing intimate relationships when you are not feeling safe in a relationship because of attachment disorder. And we worked through that, and we both, I still feel like it was the major turning point in our marriage. I also tried DBT therapy, which is dialectical behavior therapy, that it actually has mindfulness and self-regulation and many of the things that I really needed to start working on that I hadn't before. But the really big turning point for me was at age 50. I got back on stage for the first time in 10 years. And it was like, what why did I wait so long? All of the joy and the exhilaration of, and I was just an ensemble performer in Footloose, the musical. But it's like, oh my gosh, I have found my thing. And I just thought everybody can have this feeling, so that also became my goal, is to continue doing this as long as I could. So singing, dancing, moving, not being stuck in our bodies, but moving the energy out, the traumatic energy out. Was that was what was happening.
So here you are, you're back on stage, you're performing, you're feeling this joy that you had. Well, do you feel like you had lost it, or do you feel like you had never really had it? The joy.
Well, that's a really good question. I felt that it was suppressed to the point where I didn't know if I would ever access it again. And I remember as a child that I was very expressive, and I was always out, in front of the family singing and dancing and everything. But it was, it was like children should be seen and not heard kind of, oh, those, platitudes from the 50s. And so you learn to suppress that, and you learn that it's really not acceptable. And especially if you're not trained and all that stuff. So um, I didn't really know that that was going to provide so much joy and vitality and make me want to live. And so that was really the major thing, is I wanted to live again. And, I know I'm not a super, talented person, but when I get on stage, something happens, and people who've seen me are like, you definitely have that stage presence. You should be doing more of that. So I do.
I feel like it's one of those things, like, who cares if you are not great at something, right? If you love it, if it brings you joy, then do it, right? I mean, like, that's like myself, I've painted some pictures. I don't know what I'm doing. I've never been trained. I'm not an artist by any stretch of the imagination, but it's something that brings me some joy. It's, using the different colors and just creating. I'm certainly not going to be selling my art for any money, but it's something I enjoy. And that's just kind of another example. Like, nobody would say I'm good at it, but who cares? It makes me happy.
That's right. And, I believe that God gave us all something in us to express. And if it's, writing, if it's photography, if it's dance or song, any of the expressive arts are going to help you kind of connect what's inside with what's going on in your brain in a way that integrates your body and mind, toward greater health. And that was what made me decide to make my documentary, because
Yeah.
I thought, if I had this experience, then I believe other people out there have had it too. And it's been my passion to share that message with people, and that post-traumatic stress does not have to disrail your or derail your life and your relationships. And it's all about relationships for me, because we can't have healthy relationships if we're constantly in inner turmoil. Because then we go back to that mask or that cover up, or that I'm just going to make you think I'm okay.
Knowing, what you've been through, what you've learned, the processes that you've gone through, the healing, the various things you've done. How has all that kind of worked together for you, and looking at life as, it's happening for you today instead of to you? Do you have any examples of that?
I do. I have to frame it by saying I'm intentional about how to maintain regulation. So it's not easy to go through life. And I mean, we still have many things. I still have many things that come up that are extremely challenging for me. For example, the fear of disconnection from my husband because he might choose his daughter over me. That sounds crazy to say, but it is so real and so powerful that even right now talking about it makes me tear up because, you know, we work together, my husband and I, to break these things down when they come up. So there isn't a buildup of me, you know, feeling like I need to isolate or shut down and disconnect from him because he sees it. He knows it's starting. So it's a process that only I can do. I'm the only one that can, you know, mindfully regulate myself, and that is breathing, trying to continually move. For me, that's how I get that kind of connection back to my senses. And my favorite thing to do is I subscribe to a La Blast. It's a dance fitness thing that Louis Van Amstel from Dancing with the Stars leads. And I crank up the music and I sing like I just pull the music right out of my gut. And there's something about releasing that with my voice that is so powerful, and it changes my psyche, and you know, just changes everything for me. But the biggest thing I do is I process with my husband, and he does not turn away. So one of the things that the book Hold Me Tight and the Gottmans, I haven't mentioned the Gottmans, but they're really huge in the uh, marriage and intimacy world, and they have quite a following. But it's called Turning Toward, not turning away. And for most of my life, up until about age 50, I was really good at turning away, and I don't do that anymore. Because you can't heal in a relationship if two people are facing the other way, away from each other.
Exactly. Yeah. So I love what you said about being intentional about it. That's a word that Lydia and I use a lot. But it really is about making that intentional decision to do things differently. Because we all know, I think we probably all know, if we just let our emotions and feelings determine, we're going to go probably in the negative, we're going to isolate, we're going to feel bad, you know. So it's being intentional about making the choice to do things differently, process it differently, move, do something that you enjoy, you know, get your body moving, the breath, you know, whatever. I think it's like, you know, what works for you. But having that intentional movement and getting yourself out of that moment, maybe. And I mean, I've experienced that where I'll get in a mood or something really bothers me. I get, you know, depressed or really down about something. And if I just sit there in it, it doesn't get any better. But if my husband's like, hey, let's go take a walk, I feel better. So what's that about? Right. Okay. So that just to me is like confirmation that somehow getting out of that moment, that seat, that being stagnant, something doing something for me. But I have to make that decision to do it. So I love that you said that you have to, you know, you intentionally do that.
Yeah. And I like how you just mentioned the walking, because going back to what I said about the synchronicity of bodies moving together, you know, during COVID, there was an article in the paper about how if you just get out and walk with another human, it can start to help you feel better physiologically, because during this pandemic, we were so detached and it was so harmful to our mental health. But that movement and getting in sync gives your nervous system the message, oh, I'm feeling safe again. And because you're with another human, and it's a biological thing.
Yeah. We need each other. We need that human interaction. And so, I mean, that's just a really great, you know, like full circle here. How, you know, you as a child not really having that connection like you needed it, how it affected you, but then how you learned about it, you understood the reason behind your reactivity, your feelings, you found things that gave you joy, you're doing things to then help that. So now you can heal from that. You can create those relationships. So I love that. Great example of, you know, not letting life just happen to you, right? Things happen, but you've chosen to take these things that have happened and say, okay, how can I use this for me to help me as a person? So I love that. What a beautiful, beautiful story.
Okay, guys, that was a lot. As promised, I, Lydia, am here to quickly go over some of the things that Amy did to claim power in her life and to give another perspective on how we can take away those things and use them in our lives. One specific sentence that Amy said really hit me. We shared it on our social media pages a couple days ago. She said, "I had everything but joy in my life. I have felt this." So when I heard her say it, I felt it all over again. That time when I thought that I was doing everything quote unquote right, but somehow I was still unhappy. I unfortunately did not respond to that disconnect in a productive way. So eventually I was facing a crisis. As a result of this crisis, I lost trust in those around me, but more importantly, I lost trust in myself. How could I allow my life to get to such a dark place? When everything is going right and there is still an unease in your soul, take it seriously. Do the work. Our minds suppress things to make us more comfortable. The body, however, doesn't let anything go unless you do the appropriate things to release it. Also, if we look at our lives and think, I should be happy, I have all the things. Oh, there's that word should. When you hear that word, make sure you pay attention. But when we think of in this way, we are basically saying that our happiness is dependent on material things and temporary circumstances. Joy is not circumstantial. I know we hear this a lot, and you've probably heard it a million times, but I'm going to repeat it because I have heard it 1,000,002 times, and I still fall into this trap of only if. You know what I'm talking about. Only if I could get a job that I really enjoy. Only if he would stop drinking. Only if I had that house or that car or that person. Only if I looked like her. Our external reality is a reflection of what is going on inside of us. It is a reflection of our thoughts. It's like if you were to try to change the way you look by putting makeup on the actual mirror that you are looking into. Obviously, this would not work. Amy understood this, and instead of continuing to try and change the reflection, which were her circumstances, she looked within and really did the work. She wanted to understand why, even though she had everything she wanted, she still felt that unease. As I mentioned, another huge theme of this story is how the body keeps the score. Stephanie and Amy talk a lot about the mind and body connection and how trauma gets stuck in the body. We have heard a lot about this. If your thoughts feel like they are weighing you down, they literally are. The emotions are stuck, and it actually feels heavy in your physical body. And many times when we feel that heaviness, we just want to stay in bed. Movement can feel like it takes so much effort. When you feel that way, move your body. I think when we understand the why behind it, it makes it a little bit easier to be intentional. Because you probably associate movement with fitness and working out. And who's thinking about working out when they feel so stuck in their emotions? Not me. Or at least I didn't until I understood that emotion needs to move and I need to be intentional about that. Amy also talks about how she processes with her husband. I love that. Her husband understands that she is dealing with some triggers and he can see when she is triggered. This is huge. My husband does the same for me, and it is just such a pure form of love to not reject the quote unquote flaws or weaknesses, but to use them as a cue to step in and support. I used to feel like I needed to hide my insecurities from my husband because he might not like them and in turn might not like me. I was wrong. Sharing all of me with my husband has made our connection so much more real. And because I know that he chooses to help me through these things, I feel more confident in our partnership, and therefore my insecurities have way less power over me. Lastly, I want to highlight the idea of finding something that brings you joy, because joy is moving of that stagnant energy. We do not need to be quote unquote good or trained in something to receive the benefits. What if we looked at it as expressing energy and not something that is going to be judged. Maybe the people that end up being what we would say as good artists are really just fully allowing themselves to connect and express. They're not holding back, which is a skill that takes practice. When we have trauma, which we all do, we close up and we hold back because we don't feel safe. I'm a yoga teacher, and if you ever take one of my classes, you will probably hear me say things like, there are no wrong answers, and take what you need. I always encourage my students to take on the role of an observer and just watch the magic happen. Watch the energy move in their bodies and not get in the way by making judgments. Nothing is either good or bad. It simply just is. Now let's get back to the interview where Amy will share about a documentary that she made and how theater helps move trauma.
I had the great fortune to meet Bessel van der Kolk, who is one of the leading neuroscientists in the world on trauma, post-traumatic stress, and study with him for a while about the role of movement and voice in helping to unlock, traumatic experiences in the body. And he had written a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which I'm sure many, many people have read and heard about. And there's a chapter in there on theater. And I read the book and went and, studied with him and said, what do you think about this idea I have of doing this documentary? And it's not about drama therapy. Drama therapy is a actual form of therapy where you go to a therapist who works with you on doing dramatic role playing and things, and you process your emotions. What I wanted to do is talk about outside the theater. So these are people whose lives have been changed because they did theater as a form of love and therapy for them, and what they're able to do with their lives after that. So, because that was my story, they all felt that they were bad at relationships for one other reason or another. And they even, at the beginning of my time with the 4 people in the film, couldn't really describe what that was. And they didn't really understand it themselves. But after following them for between 3 to 5 years, they all went through the process of, as they performed more and we talked more, and I would ask them questions about their experiences with, connecting to other people. How was it when you got home? What are your relationships like now outside the home? These beautiful stories of healing started evolving.
And so tell folks, where could they find your documentary if they'd like to check that out?
Okay, it's they can find my documentary and stream it at www.capacityforgood.com. So that's capacity and the number 4 and the word good all together. And there's an individual streaming link there. And it's also available to institutions like colleges and universities. So there it is.
Okay, and the name of it is?
The name is Visceral, Transforming Trauma Through Theater. And I chose that name because in one of my interviews with Bessel van der Kolk, we talked about the visceral change that happens when you perform on stage, for example, and that's the internal connection of the viscera of our bodies and what happens and how that alters and helps you heal your brain.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think it's such a cool idea that you did that. So it's something, I'm sure it was something fun for you, but also very informational and helpful for others, the ones that were performing in it, as well as those that are watching it. So it's kind of brought it all together, the fun, the facts, all of that together. I really hope people listening to this have gained some hope for themselves, if they've gone through something similar, or just knowing that, whatever we have gone through, there is hope for a better future for us. So thank you for sharing your story.
Oh my gosh, thank you for talking with me and for your insights as well. And I just want to compliment you and Lydia on what a great job you're doing with this podcast. It's really lovely.
Thank you so much. If you were inspired by today's guest, be sure to save this episode so you can go back and listen to it again. Making the shift from feeling powerless to empowered is not a quick and easy thing to do, we know, but our desire is that you've gained hope and confidence that it's possible and so worth it. Now, go hit that subscribe or follow button so you don't miss the next episode.